Okay. When we start, we're going to be in Melachim Bet, Perek Yud Chet, which is chapter 18, and Pasuk Yud Gimel, number 13. So it's 18, 13 in Melachim Bet. Hey, Danny.
Hello, sir. How are you?
Oh, Hashem. Doing great. Doing great.
You like that little article?
I didn't go through it yet. I'm going to read it afterwards.
It's a short one, but it gives some nice.
Definitely take a look at it. Ezrat Hashem. Thank you very much for sharing it. Okay, I am going to get started. Please feel free, i.e., please do mute yourselves and unmute when you need. Okay. Last week, the second part of the class, we looked at one perek of 3, at least, in Sefer Yeshayahu, which is the parallel narrative of what's happening right now. We're about to continue in the next pasuk here in Melachim Bet. What we're going to do is to read a little bit more in depth now, some of these psukim, and it's going to lead us to a number of questions right away. It's going to feel, you'll see, it's going to feel like we're in the middle of a story, not really at the beginning of something. Until now, in this perek, we were introduced to Chizkiyahu HaMelech, who's going to be our main focus of, I don't like to use the word character, it sounds too literary, but we'll use it anyways. Main character for the next many weeks. And we introduced, he was a wonderful person, a good person. He did more than anyone else since the time of David to rid the country of not just Avodah Zarah, but anything that would be even close to it. Then takes a little detour and reminds us of the terrible things that occurred in the northern kingdom, which led eventually to its demise. And now it's going to focus once again on Chizkiyahu and the kingdom of Yehuda. Okay, Pasuk Yud Gimel number 13. Uva-arba'asrei shana lamelech Chizkiyahu, in the 14th year of the reign of Chizkiyahu, Allah Sancheriv melech Ashur al kol arei Yehuda. So Sancheriv, the king of Assyria, came against all the cities of Yehuda, habetzurot, those that were fortified, bayit pesem, and he captured them. So first thing I want to mention is that it says he just captured. It doesn't mention anything about a war. There's no mention of a battle, no anything. He was able to capture them with no battle. He walked in and pretty much took over these cities. Okay, now keep in mind, it says here in Pasuk Yud Gimel that this is now the 14th year of the reign of the king, of Chizkiyahu. Before that, when we first meet him at the beginning of this perek, in early parts of his career, so to speak, we learn about the things he did, right? He was a good person, I mentioned before. He was ridding the area of any vestige of Avodah Zarah, but now it's 14 years into his reign. And all of a sudden he starts telling us about Sancheriv coming against the city of Yerushalayim, the area of Yehuda. Something's missing there. Meaning, we know from plenty of times, I'll just use this week's parasha as an example, that the Torah and the Navi don't always tell us every single fact. I'll give you an example. We meet Moshe Rabbeinu basically as a baby, and as an adult, almost 80 years old. So there's 80 years that we are left with midrashim and other stories to tell us about this demut, this character, this individual who is so powerful to this very day within our in Yahadut. But then it doesn't tell us what he did on a normal Tuesday. There's this stuff that's not there. So it's left to midrashim and other sources and other traditions to be passed on from year to year to know about them. By the way, I apologize. I was also supposed to mention it now. Tonight's learning will be in Le'ili Nishmat Yaakov ben Chaim Neshama should have an aliyah. So here also, it would seem that, like, wait a minute. I understand leaving out all the details of Moshe's youth, growing up, and other things, because what is it that the Torah really wants us to focus on? Who he was as a leader, as a manhig, who we met this past week in Parshat Shemot, and who we'll see now in Va'era, is really stepping onto the stage, as it were, in Egypt. But when it comes to the narratives of the various kings, there have been some very detailed narratives when it comes to what kings did. So he did all this. He got rid of all these avodah zarah things, and all of a sudden, it's 14 years later, and now Sancheriv comes to attack. What happened in the meantime? We're going to come to that shortly. Take a look at Pasuk Yud Daled. What happens? Vayishlach Chizkiyahu melech Yehuda. We're in Pasuk Yud Daled, number 14. Vayishlach Chizkiyahu melech Yehuda el melech Ashur Lachisha. So Chizkiyahu sends messengers to the king of Assyria, who was based himself in Lachish, which was the most fortified area in that area. This place in that area. Leimor, he said, Chatati, I have sinned. Shuv me'alai, back away from me. Et asher titen alai esa, whatever you put on me, in other words, whatever tax you're going to place upon me, I'm going to raise, I'll bring it to you. Vayasem melech Ashur al Chizkiya melech Yehuda, 300 kikar kesef, u'shloshim kikar zahav. He said, the following is what you're going to pay me. It would be 300 talents of silver, which was a huge amount, and 30 talents of gold. I'm going to read one more pasuk and raise a question. Chizkiyahu took all the money that was found in the storehouses, or the treasury, I should say, of the Beit HaMikdash, and anything that was in the king's home. So one thing we could say in his favor was he didn't take it from the people. What did he do? He took all the available funds that he had from both his own personal account, so to speak, and the national treasury from the Beit HaMikdash, instead of getting money from the people, and he gave it to the king of Assyria. So here's the question. Two questions. One is I already asked, which is, what's been going on till now? This sounds like all of a sudden, boom, Sancheriv attacks. The other question is, we just said, go back for a second to the very beginning of the parak of Yud Chet. Take a look. It's worth reading again. Go back to Pasuk Gimel, number 3. I'm going to reread this. Gimel and Vayaz hayashar b'nei Hashem k'chol asher asa David aviv. Right? He was straight as an arrow. He was like David. He was strong. He was a good person. The next pasuk tells us how he destroyed the various avodah zarahs, and including the chushtan, which was the copper snake that Moshe Rabbeinu had made to ward off a plague, and a few people ended up serving it as an idol. Then look at pasuk Hey, number 5. B'Hashem Elokei Yisrael batach. He trusted in God. V'acharav lo haya kamo. There was no one like him, and all the kings of Judah, neither before him or after him. One more pasuk, Vav, and he clinged to God. We talked about the concept of dvekut. He didn't turn away from me, kept all the mitzvot, right? Now, wait a minute. Sancheriv comes in, and he folds like a card table. Really? There's nothing. Sancheriv comes in, where's all the davening to God? Where's the go to battle against him to protect your country? He saw what had happened in the northern kingdom. Why didn't he do something? Okay. It's not obvious, but it's obvious we're in the middle of something. We don't have the whole picture here. So we're going to look at a couple things. First, I'm going to take a look at the first slide here. Okay. Vayishlach Chizkiyahu. This is Pasuk Yud Daled, where it says he sent to the king of Assyria basically a message that says, you just tell me what you need me to do, I'll do it. Chizkiyahu ro'eh shehazam shekila et mamlechet Shomron natush gam al Yehuda. Chizkiyahu saw that which happened, the terrible things, the tragedy that happened and ended and caused the end of the Mamlechet Shomron, meaning the northern kingdom, is now heading towards Yehuda. As was expressed in the words of the Nevi'im of that time period. We're going to see what that means. Remember, we saw that even though the audience for most of the Perek Yud Zayin was the northern kingdom, but it was one pasuk in there that was geared towards the area of Yehuda. I said, like, guys, you got to listen up to this too. Al Kain, therefore, who machlit ki et kni'ah, who Chizkiyahu decided that right now was a time to subjugate himself. Until he saw that the people were fit, it was appropriate for the time of salvation. So the first thing we're told here is that Chizkiyahu HaMelech felt that, look, I need to act right now one way. And that one way seems to be, I'm going to do what he needs me to do to keep him off our back, because I know what potentially could happen. And maybe the people are not yet ready for this salvation, this Yeshua. Okay, but we're going to take a look at the beginning of Perek Lamed Bet in Divrei Hayamim. If you have Divrei Hayamim, you want to look in your Tanakh. It's Divrei Hayamim Bet. You'll see on the very bottom of the slide the citation. Pasuk, I think it's actually starting with Pasuk Aleph, in chapter 32. Pasuk in Perek Lamed Bet.
Lamed what?
It's Lamed Bet in Divrei Hayamim Bet. And you're going to go to Pasuk. It's really from the very beginning. I think that starts Pasuk Bet, but I think it's really Pasuk Aleph where I start. I'm not going to read every single word here. I mean, I'm going to read it, but I'm not going to translate every word. But I want you to get a feel for what's going on. Now, this perek in Divrei Hayamim Bet, Lamed Bet, is the parallel perek to what we're just now about to read. Remember, we just said in Pasuk Yud Dalet, actually Yud Gimel, Sancheriv comes against Yehuda. Okay, let's see how it's presented in Divrei Hayamim. And by the way, I'll give you a little spoiler alert. We're still in the middle. We still aren't at the beginning of the story. We're still going to have to see more in a few minutes. Here we go. Chizkiyahu saw Sancheriv come, and that his face, his face was, he wanted to do battle with Jerusalem. So what did he do? The first thing he did, it doesn't mention anything of this here, is that he took counsel with his officers, and basically the idea was to seal up any of the outskirts, outside the city, any of the wells, so they wouldn't have any water for the enemy. They gathered together, they closed up the wells and the river, and said, why should we allow the Assyrians to come and find all this water? Like, why should we send in, truckloads of medicine and things to our enemy? Yeah. ויבן את כל החומה הפרוצה, ויעל על המגדלות, ולחוצה החומה אחרת, ויחזק את המילו, עיר דוד, ויעש שלח לרוב מגינים. I'm going to read a few psukim, actually, and that's it. Just skip down to here. חזקו ואמצו, be strong. אל תיראו, don't be afraid, ואל תחתו. מפני מלך אשור, don't be scared of the king of Assyria. He's telling his people. ומפני כל ההמון אשר עמו, nor be afraid in front of all the people that come with him. Ki imanu rav me'amo, we have more than he has. What do we have? Imo zroa basar. He has, meaning Sancheriv, has the power of human. Vi imanu Hashem Elokeinu le'ezreinu. We have the help of Hashem. Ulilachem milchamtenu, to fight our battle. Vayismechu ha'am al divrei Chizkiyahu melech Yudah. And the people relied on what he said. Wait a minute. What the heck? Look at this perek, what we're just now reading. He goes, he sends a message to the king of Assyria, boom, whatever you want, I'm going to give to you. In the meantime, we go to Sefer Divrei Hayamim. What do we see? That he's all, he's being extremely proactive, sealing up wells and making this cry out to the people, basically saying, they have their chariots and they have their wagons, they have their runners and everything else, but we have God on our side. And they accepted it, and they were all riled up against this king. And yet he sends basically a note saying, "Okay, whatever you want, guy. Here, just tell me. I'll just tell me how many zeros in the checkbook I have to write."
He destroyed his country in the meantime.
Yes.
I mean, he was all the way up to.
No. You mean Chizkiyahu did?
No, the Sennacherib.
Sancheriv did. Yeah, there's no question he did.
I mean, there was only Jerusalem left.
But right. So really, I'm talking about the greater Jerusalem area right now. By the way, I want to remind you something, and I know I've said this before. Now, a number of you know this, but I need to repeat it because it's not something that's just a muvan me'elav. When we talk about Yerushalayim, the ancient Jerusalem, the area that has what we call the old city and the wall around the old city. The wall around the old city is new. It's about 500 years old, right? Built by Solomon the Magnificent. We're talking Ir David. We're talking the great area around Ir David, and then the Beit HaMikdash area, of course, Har HaBayit, which is what we call the old city. It wasn't an old city then, but there was no wall at that point, at least not that one. But whatever it was, and wherever we're talking about, there seem to be two different narratives going on. But we're going to see. But wait, there's more. Let's take a look at the next pasuk in our parak. If you're using also the book for Divrei, I mean, keep it open. We're going to go back to it. Look, please, now at pasuk Tet Zayin. So in Tet Vav, we saw that Chizkiyahu gathered all the kesef, all the money that was in the treasury, and all the stuff that he had in his own palace. Tet Zayin, number 16. Ba'etahi, at that time, Kitzatz Chizkiyahu et daltote chal Hashem ve'eta omnot. At that time, Chizkiyahu cut away the doors of the Heichal, the entryway to the Beit HaMikdash, and the omnot. The omnot we're going to translate right now as the lintels. The thresholds. Asher tzipah Chizkiyahu melech Yehuda, that Chizkiyahu had overlaid with gold. Vayitnem lemelech Ashur, and he gave him to the king of Assyria. This is kind of, I don't want to use the, God forbid, this is a negative sounding word, but this is kind of like a throwaway pasuk. Like, wait, what? What are you talking about? He cut off the overlay of gold on these doors. And what do you mean he did this? This is the Beit HaMikdash. This was done centuries before already. So that tells us there's still more to the story. There is a famous story that I imagine some of you have heard. I'm going to tell it to you now anyways. It's brief. It just popped into my head to try to lekasher it to here, to connect it to here. And so those of you who've heard it, you can go to sleep for 2 minutes. A teacher brought into his classroom a glass jar and put inside the glass jar 2 very large rocks. Held out to the class and asked the class if the jar was full. And many of them said, yeah, it's full. And he reached under his desk and he brought out a bunch of little rocks, and he poured a lot of little rocks into the jar. And he asked it, held it up again. He said, is the jar full? And all at once said, yeah, it's all full. And then he took some sand and poured sand in there, packed it in. And he held it up again. He says, is it full now? And everyone said, of course it's full. Then he took out a cup of water and he poured it in. It was absorbed into the sand. And he's held it up and he says, is it full now? And everyone said yes. And the teacher said yes. And he said, then the teacher asked, what lesson do you get from this experiment? So someone stood up and said that the lesson that he felt that everyone in this room had gotten was that you can always do more. You can always put more into the jar, so to speak. The teacher says exactly the opposite. He says, if you don't put in the big stones first, you're never going to be able to get them in. You have to put in what's important, what's significant first. Everything else is secondary. Because if you go to everything secondary and then you try to get back to the primary, you're going to have a very hard time. And I thought about that story because it's a nice lesson, nice moral lesson. But I thought about it here for a reason. Because I feel like we're standing with this glass jar. We're told about, hey, we have this unbelievable king. He's finally someone that we can have this whole litany of kings, both in the northern kingdom and even in the area of Yerushalayim, where we're finally hearing from someone who's really good. And then, at least just on the surface of this parak, he kind of folds right away. But then there's this hint that something else happened. And we found out from Sefer Divrei Yamim in Parak Lamed Bet that he actually did something else before he just kind of what appears to be to fold. He also did something proactive for battle. And now it's telling us that is kind of like, what's going on here? He took the doors that were overlaid in gold that he said that he himself, that Chizkiyahu had overlaid, and he scraped off the gold and he gave it to the king of Assyria. So that has to tell us something else is going on. So yes, there is something else going on. Let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, before we look at that, I want to look at this. Actually, no, I'm not going to do that. Okay, this is in Divrei Hayamim. Also, this is, I believe, Perek Kaf Tet. I don't think I wrote down. This is, I believe, Kaf Tet. Okay. I'm going to read some of this to you. This is in, if you look in Divrei Yamim, this is, remember, this is Kaf Tet. This is 3 chapters before the narrative that begins with Sancheriv coming against Jerusalem. There's 3 other chapters there, which means that our story, our narrative here, where we started in Pasuk Yud Gimel, the narrative that began in Perek Lamed Bet in Divrei Yamim is the middle of the story. And then I said to you, wait a minute, it's 19 years or whatever it was. How many years it was? 14 years, 19 years, 14th year of his reign. All of a sudden, what was the background? So let's fill in a little bit. Chizkiyahu Malach ben 25 shana ו29 shana Malach בירושלים ושם אמו אביה בת זכריה. Tells him who he was, his mother's name. ויעש הישר בעיני השם ככל אשר עשה דוד אביו. Again, just like we saw here, he was a good guy, did like his father David. הוא בשנה הראשונה למולכו, בחודש הראשון, פתח את דלתות בית השם. In the very first month of his rule, he opened the doors of the Beit HaMikdash. ויחזקם, and he fortified them. ויבוא את הכהנים, ויבא את הכהנים ואת הלוויים, he gathered the כהנים and לוויים, ויאספם לרחוב המזרח. ויאמר להם, he gathered them and told them, שמעוני הלוויים, listen up. עתה התקדשו, it's hard for me to see all the nikudot when I cut and pasted. Et Beit Hashem Elokei Avotechem, Otziu et ha'nida min hakodesh. He says to take out all of those things that don't belong in the Beit HaMikdash. Evidently, already in his time, the Beit HaMikdash had fallen into disrepair. There were things in there, or maybe old remnants of Avodah Zarah that were brought in. Ki ma'alu avotenu, because our forefathers trespassed. Vasura b'nei Hashem Elokeinu, did evil in the eye of Hashem. Yazvuhu, vayazvuhu, vayasobu pneihem mimishkan Hashem. Vayitnu oref, I can't see what it says. Zagam sagru daltot ha'olam vayifku vayechabu et hanerot uktoret oiktiru. So all these things, a list of things. Oh, one more. V'ola lo ha'elu b'kodesh lalokei Yisrael. So it says that they stopped bringing the Ketoret, they started bringing Korbanot, they started basically turn their back on the Beit HaMikdash. And he goes on here and tells us a whole bunch of things from many, many psukim, which we're not going to read now, a whole bunch of things that happened that Chizkiyahu fortified the Beit HaMikdash, which is so difficult for us to understand and comprehend, that had really fallen into disrepair, into neglect. One of the things it says he did was he covered all the doors with gold. He overlaid them in gold. It's those very doors that he himself had seen to. Now he's taking off the gold and sending it to the king. And this is now the commentary on this pasuk where it says Kitzatz Chizkiyahu daltot eichal, that Chizkiyahu did that. Reading from over here, the gold was attached very strongly to the doors. So they kind of chipped away at the doors to take part of the door with the overlaid gold to remove them. It must have been very, very disturbing, like I mean, that was very confusing for the people to hear what was going on in the Beit HaMikdash. And therefore, the king is taking off the doors, the king is removing the gold, the king is taking all this money. It caused the people to lose hope. Which we're going to see a number of weeks from now, when we see Chizkiyahu's son Menashe, how this is going to manifest itself. Evidently, Chachamim did not agree with what Chizkiyahu was doing. What does this mean? I kind of made light of the fact that Chizkiyahu all he did was the king of Assyria is here, boom, okay, tell me what I can give you. Then I jumped over to Divrei Yamim, and we see, wait a minute, there's actually other stuff he was doing. He was also stopping up the wells, preventing the water from flowing outside, so that when the enemy would be upon them, they wouldn't have water. What was he doing? He was doing that which Yaakov Avinu did prior to meeting again with Esav in the beginning of Parshat Vayishlach. Yishlach Yaakov Malachim el Esav Achiv. And we see there that Rashi tells us that Yaakov Avinu prepared himself, Doron, Milchama, Utfila, that he prepared himself in 3 different ways. I'm going to come to this pasuk. I'm leaving it on the screen in a minute and come to it. That he prepared himself 3 different ways in advance of meeting with Esav. 1, Doron. He had a present ready for him. Remember, he had all these animals and things. Tfilah, he davened to Hashem, and Milchama. Remember, he split up the camp, and if they come to one camp, so there'll be people who still survive. So he prepared himself in 3 different ways. Chizkiyahu HaMelech does the same thing. Now, there's a midrash in Kohelet Rabbah based on the pasuk in Kohelet that you see in front of you now. Pasuk says as follows: Ve'amarti and I said, Ve'amarti ani and I said, Tova chokhma migevura. Wisdom is better than valor. I'll read the rest of the pasuk. It doesn't play in for the rest of what we're going to talk about now, but just to finish the pasuk, Ve'chokhmata misken bezuya udvarav einam nishmaim. And a poor man's wisdom is scorned, and his words are not heeded. But for our purpose right now, we want to take a look at these few words at the beginning. Tova chokhma migevura. Chokhma is better than wisdom is better than might. Let's take a look at what the midrash says in Kohelet Rabbah. Before this midrash, it took those 2 words, Tova Chokhmah, and was trying to apply them to different individuals. Among them was Yaakov Avinu. Now here's another opinion that's brought. Davar acher, Tova Chokhmah, zo chokhmato shel Chizkiyahu melech Yehuda. This is the wisdom of Chizkiyahu, king of Yehuda. Miklei krav shel Sancheriv. Amar Rabbi Levi, shalosh galuyot higla Sancheriv. There were 3 exiles that Sancheriv was involved in. Pam rishona higla shevet Ruven v'Gad. The first time we know that we saw this around. Remember that all the exiles of the Jews in Israel, which spanned 130 years, the first one we read about, which is a partial, which is Gad and Ruven and Gad. The second one was the Sheniya Aseret HaShvatim, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, which we've learned about. Shlishit Ba'al Yehuda. And the third one, he comes to Jerusalem area, to Yehuda. Miyad amar Chizkiyahu v'zinam klei zayin mibifnim, yiblisham levanim mibachutz. What does that mean? Literally means he prepared them with weapons of war on the outside, and he dressed them in white on the inside. We're going to see. And he prepared himself 3 ways. Litfilah, doron, ulemilchama. Exactly what Rashi says, and others, he's quoting the Midrash also, that Yaakov Avinu prepared himself in these 3 ways. Dichtiv, it says in Yeshayahu. Now notice he's quoting from Yeshayahu and Melachim, and down here from Divrei Yamim. There's a reason, because the Tfilah, Milchama, and Doron are in different places. Here. How do we know he prepared for Tfilah? It doesn't say that here. We didn't see it in Divrei Yamim, but it's there for Yeshayahu in Pasuk Lamed Zayin, which we're going to touch on. We were last week, but we didn't get that far. Vayitpalel Chizkiyahu el Hashem. It says very clearly he davened to Hashem. Lidoron. How do we know he prepared with some gift? We see that here. Dichtiv Vayitahi Katzatz Chizkiyahu v'chulei vet omnot. So it says he took down the gold coverings of the doors and the omnot. Ma'u omnot. Rabbi Levi Amar Tzifriya. It meant in Rabbanan, I mean Shigmaya. So it means the thresholds, which are also overlaid in gold. So far we saw they prepared for Tfilah. He prepared for Doron. And now, for Tfilah and Doron. What about Milchama? We already know. The Milchama Shenemar. We just looked at this a few minutes ago. Vayas Shelach v'Rav u'Maginim v'Na'atz Cherev al Petach Beit HaMidrash. We didn't get to that pasuk, but in pasuk lamed perak lamed bet, we were reading the idea, that whole section of the preparing by shutting down the water system that's outside the city. All that was for one particular purpose. That purpose was to prepare for war. So now this is what I'm trying to get across. last week, when I gave a little, or maybe 2 weeks ago, I don't remember anymore, when I gave an introduction to Chizkiyahu, I had a reason for mentioning that the narrative is in 3 different Svarim. It's here in Sefer Melachim, it's in Sefer Yeshayahu, and we will have Yeshayahu himself quoted and will show up in Sefer Melachim. And it's also in Divrei Yamim. No chiddush. I mean, we know that everything we've learned when it comes to the kingdom of Yehuda, one way or another, is going to be found to some degree in Sefer Divrei Yamim and in some of the other Nevi'im, because the Nevi'im lived contemporaneously with those narratives. So what's the purpose why I mention it? Because of this. To show that you cannot look, if you really want to get a full picture of what was going on in Israel at that time, under Chizkiyahu's reign, which was going to be the beginning of the eventual downfall of the kingdom of Yehuda as well, you have to see the whole picture. It included Tfilah, Doron, and Milchama. Here in Sefer Melachim, we see the Doron. In Sefer Dvarim, Divrei Yamim, we saw the Milchama, and in Sefer Yeshayahu, which we didn't look at tonight, we saw the Tfilah. And of course, we also know there's a concept in Yadut, which is Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim. That which our forefathers did is a sign, portend for what's going to happen for us. It also means that they act as signposts for us in ways that we can approach certain things. The truth is that a person, you and I, we don't need to be in a fight for a mortal fight for our lives to really take the lesson of Tfilah, Doron, and Milchama. There are very often situations that we might find ourselves in that can be contentious. It could be work, it could be family, it could be neighbors, it could be communal things. And we sometimes have a certain derech. Here's how we want to handle. We're going to go, head on. There are people who are not risk averse, who hate conflict. There are people who will avoid conflict. People who love conflict. There are people who try to sweet talk their way out of something. But through Yaakov Avinu and through Chizkiyahu, we can also see that there is a method that we can use at times when it's appropriate, where we prepare ourselves. One should never, ever, ever go into a situation, whether it's a sichsuch, a disagreement, let's say, with the person in your building, with your neighbor, with the community, with a family member, without first a little tefillah. I'll tell you, I know I've mentioned this over the years a couple times. When I became the rabbi of the shul in Chicago, that's now 22 years ago. Whoa, a long time. I went to one of the senior rabbis in the community and I asked him for one piece of advice. I said, I don't want a Dvar Torah. I'm not looking for a drasha. I don't want you to sit there and lecture me. I want one sentence, just one thing. I didn't say it exactly like that because that would not be appropriate. One piece of advice. And he told me that every time you sit down with somebody, whether it's a couple, an individual, always say a very brief tefillah before you start. Ask Hashem's help. And most of the time I try to remember to do that. In general, people don't. In general, people, they want to tell something to their boss, or they want to say something to their spouse, or there's a problem, like I say, the community or a neighbor, and they just go at it. Stop, breathe, prepare yourself with tefillah. Doron may or may not be an appropriate gesture at some time. And milchama doesn't necessarily mean you have to stop up their water well next door to you and take out the spear. But you have to be prepared. If you're going to get into a battle, be careful. I have found myself in a battle of wits with unarmed opponents many times. Think about that. Anyways, I'll let that sink in. So we get now this greater picture of who Chizkiyahu was. Now we can understand, if we look back, you don't have to turn back, I'll just reread it. Now we can understand the introduction to this parak, the first couple of psukim, that he was Vayaseh Yashar b'nei Hashem. He was like David HaMelech, and he believed in Hashem. That comes to complete fruition in Divrei Yamim when he tells Am Yisrael, look, they come with their people, they got humans on their side, we got God on our side. I also want to point out parenthetically, there's a misconception of this mizmor that we say every day in davening before Uva L'Tzion, where it says at the end, and I quoted it before, Ela barecha ve'ela basusim, anachnu b'shem Hashem Elokeinu naskir. They come with their horses and their chariots, and we come with God's name. Okay, many people think that means they got the weapons, but we got God. We could just sit back. It's not what it means at all. It means they have their weaponry, and we have our weaponry. But in our arsenal, we have one thing they don't have, and that is Hashem on our side. And hopefully always on our side. We've seen in many times, Sefer Shoftim, Sefer, not so much in Sefer Shmuel, but in Sefer Melachim. Hashem is, I couldn't say he's not on our side, but he's let us fight our own battle sometimes without his involvement, whatever that means. Okay, let's continue now, next pasuk. Okay, pasuk, hold on, Yud Zayin, number 17. I just want to check one thing before I shoot my mouth off, which would not be good.
Rabbi,
Yes.
are we concerned at all that when Chizkiyahu raided the temple treasury or took off the gold of the doors, is that considered hekdesh?
That's a good question. What you're referring to would be what we known as me'ila, mem ayin yud lamed he, me'ila, which means trespassing, using something that's hekdesh for something chol, for something like, for example, to take something that was meant to scoop up the ashes and use it to, to scoop up something in your house, a little shovel in your house. So that would be me'ila. The question here is, do the doors have a level hekdesh like that? And the answer is, I don't think so, because then he wouldn't be able to do it. I don't think so. Not to that level, at least. Not to the level of the kelim of the Mishkan, not the Beit HaMikdash. It's a very good question. Okay. I'm going to do one more pasuk. Yud Zayin. Vayishlach melech Ashur et Tartan ve'et Rav Saris ve'et Rav Shakeh min Lachish el melech Chizkiyahu bechel kaved Yerushalayim. Notice what happens. The king of Assyria sent 3 people, Tartan, Rav Saris, and Rav Shakeh. He sent them from Lachish. Remember, this is evidently where he's based now because it's the most fortified city in this area. And he sends them to the king Chizkiyahu with a great heavy amount of soldiers. Vaya'alu vayavo Yerushalayim, and they came up, and they came to Jerusalem. Vaya'alu vayavo, and they came up and they went. Vayamdu b'te'alata brecha ha'elyona asher b'mesilat tzedek koves. It gives us the name of a location where they came to. And I mentioned last week that Bezrat Hashem, my buddy, my friend, a man whom I have tremendous respect for, Barnea Selavan, will enlighten us about this. And we'll talk about Chizkiyahu's broad wall, which doesn't really appear in Melachim, but we're going to talk about it anyways at some point, sometime in next month, Bezrat Hashem, when he's free. And we're going to come back to this one pasuk. Where is this? There's another topic that comes up frequently early in the battle for the city of Ir David, where David says, whoever touches the tzinor, some of you may remember this, like that will be like the one we shows that we captured everything, then et cetera, et cetera. So the question, of course, was, what is the tzinor? So there's people at Ir David today that will show you where they believe that the tzinor is referring to. But this Te'alat HaBrecha Yonah, which I've heard Barnea speak about many years ago, I will not begin to pretend I know exactly the location, but he can tell you exactly the best of the archaeological information and historical and Tanakh background that he has. Okay, so for those of you who have a very good memory, you'll remember that last week when we looked at the pasuk in Sefer Yeshayahu, it said that he sent Rav Shakeh. He sent this man, Rav Shakeh. Doesn't say anything about these other guys. So let's take a look at a slide. It'll be the last one for the evening. There we go. Okay, this one right here says Et Tartan. Shlosha anashim niskarim kan. There are 3 people mentioned here. Shnai mehem hayu Ashurim. 2 of them were Assyrian. The Echad, Rav Shakeh, surprise, surprise. Sheyesh omrim ki az ze shem prati, ein ze shem prati ela toar tzvai. That some say that Rav Shakeh was actually a military title and was not his name. Haya Yehudi Mumar. He was an apostate Jew. Ulai me'aseret hashvatim shaya b'sherut melech Ashur. Possibly someone from the 10 tribes who served the king of Assyria. Tartan nizkar gam b'Yeshayahu kaf aleph keholech b'shlichut sargon. Now, before I read the rest of his commentary, I want to mention something. I imagine some of you have heard of Pablo Cristiani. Am I correct? You can just go like this if you want. Okay, some of you have. Okay, Pablo Cristiani was Jewish. And he lived in the time of the Ramban, and he went to the king of, I want to say Spain, but it's not.
Aragon.
Right, thank you. And he said that the Jews, their Bible is really, it's anti-Christian, it's all bad, it's no good, and I'm gonna prove it to you. So long story short, I'm not going to go into the whole thing. He has what ended up being what's called a public disputation, the Kuach of the Ramban. There's a movie, it's poorly made, and I think it's even black and white, but poorly made, called The Disputation in English. It is a reenactment of what happened, which was basically a public debate between the Ramban and the church about the Talmud and the Bible, and hands down, the Ramban won. However, the king basically said, you lost, but we're going to let you live because you're very smart and you really made your case well. I mean, I'm taking literally many days of discussion and just boiling it down to one point. We also know that throughout history, literally throughout Jewish history, some of our biggest enemies have been Jewish apostates. They have been the people that have riled up the government against the Jewish people. They have been people who have caused deaths of many Jews, no different than Pablo Cristiani and others. And we actually have done something proactive about that. If you look in the Gemara, Masechet Brachot, you'll know that we talk about there the evolution of the Shmona Esrei. 120 Rabbanim got together and Sheikh Knesset Agdolah and agreed on the text of the Shmona Esrei, which is obviously miraculous in and of itself that 120 rabbis agreed on anything. But there are 18 brachot. But if you know and you look at pay attention a little bit, we know there are 19 brachot. The last one, the one that was added, was called Birkat Tamidim. It starts in, right. So in Nusach Ashkenaz, it starts Lamal Shinim, Velamal Shinim. In others, Adot Mizrach, it's Lamini Velamal Shinim. And it's exactly about talebearers, people who would go to the government, Jewish, not Jewish, and would cause the Jews to be in big trouble. Whether it was in Soviet Russia when Jewish neighbors were informed on their neighbors, whether it was in the Middle Ages in the time of the Ramban, it was in ancient times, or it's in the time of the Tanakh, where you have someone like Rav Shakeh, who was an apostate, who's the one, as we already saw last week in what his speech basically was. And thank you to Danny for sending an article, which you can take a look at after the class or at any time in your free time about Rav Shakeh.
Yes, and it happens to talk about the possibility of him being Jewish because that's how we knew he.
Very good, very good. But he was a mumar. A mumar is, like I say, an apostate. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, in both in Yerushalmi and Bavli, discuss this. There can't be necessarily 100% statement that he for sure was. Evidently, there's not enough evidence, but it seems to be that way from the little bit I read. I'll read the article and see what he says over there. But again, the point being that while we read something like this in this narrative in the Navi, we have something to this very day that we do, that we try to protect ourselves, at least to the essence of tefillah, in the Lamal Shinim. Now, I'm going to segue for a minute. And it comes from the fact that I taught tefillah over the last 22 years, a total of probably 12 years of tefillah teaching, maybe more. So I'm going to just mention something. The tefillah, the bracha in Nusach Ashkenaz and Sfard, not Sfarad, but Nusach Sfard, starts Vilamal Shinim, and to the talebearers. The original bracha, and it's the way it's said by Adot Mizrach, is Laminim Velamal Shinim, Minim are the, I don't know what the right word in English, not apostates, heretics. The heretics and the apostates, the talebearers. So there was a concern about using the word minim, and therefore it was redacted. It was taken out of the certain nusach of certain adot, including Ashkenaz, which is left with the vilam al shinim. That's what the vav is the and. However, there's another bracha in Nusach Ashkenaz in the Shemona Esrei that also begins with a vav, which is kind of strange, which is V'lirushalayim ircha barachamim tashuv. Adot Mizrach says Tishkom b'toch Yerushalayim. Doesn't start off that way, but the bracha in Shemona Esrei is V'lirushalayim. By the way, another parentheses within a parentheses, it's not the le Yerushalayim. Look at your Siddur, it's V'li Yerushalayim. For those of you who are dikduk savvy, you'll know that you can't have two Shva Nas in a row. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. So therefore, the both Shva Nas combined to become a chirik or an I. So it's V'li Yerushalayim. So it's wrong to say V'li Yerushalayim. Anyways, back end of the first parentheses. So we say V'li Yerushalayim echa barachamim tashuv, and the Jerusalem return. Right? I understand V'lam al shinim because we're hinting that there was another word that was taken out by the censors. So it said laminim v'lam al shinim, and now it just says v'lam al shinim. So what's the vav v'li Yerushalayim? Therefore, I have an opinion that I honestly don't think I've ever seen anywhere. There are many reasons why, and I have my own opinion why. Yerushalayim is known as it says in Tehillim, Ir shechuvra layachtav. It's a concept of the city is a unifying city. It brings people together. I'm leaving politics completely out of this. It's a unifying city. The vav in Hebrew can do a few things. In biblical Hebrew, it's called the vav hahipuch, which means it takes the future tense and makes it past. For example, vayomer means and he said, not and he will say. In regular modern day Hebrew and other Hebrew, the vav also serves as something called a vav hachibur. It's a connecting vav. I think that that the Chachamim put the vav there for that purpose. That it's as you say the word V'li Yerushalayim, part of the meaning behind that is that Yerushalayim is the mechaber, it's that which connects all Jews around the world because Yerushalayim is the center of the universe, literally and figuratively.
But then chubra is the passive, and you would need an active verb, not a passive verb.
Correct.
I always connected it with the six-day walk because you had the two parts of Yerushalayim with v'chubra layachdav. I thought it was kind of nevuah.
That's good. That's good. I like. I'm going to add one more thing. In the Mizmor, it also says Yerushalayim harim saviv la, v'Hashem saviv la'amo me'ata v'ad olam. That Yerushalayim is surrounded by mountains, and God surrounds His people at all times, meaning us, the Jewish people. And I've said, done this with groups actually. I said, okay, so fortification-wise, great. Hashem put mountains all around. It's hard. If you stand by the Kotel, you'll see there's mountains all around the place, and it's very obvious. But okay, what was the symbolism? Of course, Hashem surrounding us. But I have an additional more of a emotional response to that pasuk. When you haven't seen somebody, imagine, God willing, Bezrat Hashem, the Karo, Chamsa, we'll be out of this COVID nonsense. You can finally go back to properly greeting your loved ones, a big hug, whatever. So what do? We give someone a hug you haven't seen for a while, especially. You grab them, you hold them around. So these mountains around Yerushalayim are there also, like Hashem constantly showing He's giving this big hug to Am Yisrael. It's the center of the world. This is the place that Hashem chose, the Shaken Shemo Sham, and Hashem is always protecting it. So Hashem Salaviv Lamo Me'ata V'ad Olam, but also this big hug around Am Yisrael. I know I've gone far afield from this section here, but hey, I got the microphone, so you can put me on mute too, I guess. So here's what I want to do. The next part here is the beginning of the speech, where they have the people from the king who come listen to Rav Shakeh speak. I'm going to put that off now till next week, Bezrat Hashem. We're going to pick it up. We're going to listen to his speech. This, by the way, is a very long parak, if I remember right. It's like mem something. No, just a Lamed Zayin. Okay, we're about halfway through the parak almost. Look at his speech. I'm not necessarily going to compare everything to Sefer Yeshayahu, but a little bit. And we're going to also hear from Yeshayahu coming up soon. But again, I want to remind you that this narrative that started here in Perek Yud Chet goes Yud Chet, Yud Tet, Kaf, I think up to Kaf Aleph. Multiple chapters that really give us a wonderful insight into what was going on in the time of Chizkiyahu, and a major nes that not a lot of people are aware of that takes place unless you get to this point in Sefer Melachim. So in the meantime, have a Shavua Tov. It's good to see you all. Stay healthy. And we'll talk Bezrat Hashem. For those of you who are in the Kuzari class, I'll see you here Wednesday morning, Bezrat Hashem. Be well.
Hashem.
Kol tov.
Kol tov. Laila tov.
Kol tov.